What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the shop. You know, sometimes people will ask me, hey, at NewtonMakes, how is it your miter joints are so rad and awesome all the time? Okay, maybe no one's used those exact words, but I do get asked quite often about how to make miter joints. So today, that's what we're gonna talk about. We're gonna talk about my process for making simple miter joints for boxes or picture frames. I cut all of my miters right here at the table saw. Nope, I don't use a miter saw to cut miters. What do I use a miter saw for? I think I use it to break down rough lumber. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't really use a miter saw. I find it more accurate for me to cut them right here at the table saw, so let me show you that. I have a really nice table saw, I'm not gonna lie about that. But at the same time, I didn't start off with this. I started off with like a $90 saw, and then I worked my way up and bought multiple saws until I got to the point where I can afford a cabinet saw. But regardless of the saw that I had, it always came with one of these, a miter gauge. Now, this is good. You can put it into the T-slot and you can use that to cut your miters. Now, there's a downside to this, and that is the size of the fence itself. This is a pretty small area. And yes, you can screw in a sacrificial fence, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you have to put a really long fence on there with this little piece of metal or aluminum, you can get a lot of flex, and that will throw off your miters. So I always recommend having a pretty good miter fence. They don't have to be super expensive. You can make your own as long as it's rigid and fairly long. Regardless of the miter gauge you use, I still recommend using a sacrificial fence. So in my case, I grabbed this piece of scrap pine. It doesn't matter what you use. Plywood's good, MDF's good, whatever, as long as it's flat. And we're gonna clamp it here to our gauge. There are two big reasons for why we want to have a sacrificial fence. The first one is to get clean cuts. If we have the fence and then we cut our workpiece, now we have some support on our workpiece. So when that blade goes through your workpiece, it's less likely to splinter. You're just gonna get cleaner cuts. The second reason is for safety. If we do not have a sacrificial fence and we cut our workpiece, the offcut is kind of dangling there between the table and the blade, and then it's gonna hit the blade and it's gonna fly up, it's gonna hit you in the eyeball. But if you have a fence, when you cut through, it should push that extra piece off out of the way, thus saving your eyeball. Before we mess around with cutting 45-degree angles, let's make sure that our fence is at 90 degrees to the blade. It's much easier to figure that out now while the blade is sticking straight up than it is whenever it's at an angle. Mine looks dead on, but if it wasn't, that's when I would just make a couple adjustments to my fence until it was at 90 degrees. Now, one thing to say is that I am doing this after I've attached my sacrificial fence. I don't check it before, because what if I attach this fence and for some reason this fence isn't dead flat, or there's a hump to it or something like that, and that throws off my cuts. So I attach it, then check the angle. Now that we have all that worked out, we can talk about making the blade exactly at 45 degrees. Okay, a couple tips to getting good 45-degree angles. First, this scale here in your saw, don't pay attention to that. Always measure the blade. This scale's probably not right. The second thing is that you have positive stops usually inside your saw. That way, when you're turning your wheel or your handle to move your blade from 90 to 45 and back, it's gonna stop naturally. That's because it's butting up against some sort of bolt to make it a positive stop. Now you can usually adjust that bolt. So once you get your saw to 45 degrees, adjust that bolt down so that you know every time you turn your wheel, it stops there, you're gonna be at 45 degrees. I still recommend checking your blade before you start making all of your cuts, but you know you're gonna be really, really close regardless. Now that we made that first cut, we have a curve in our sacrificial fence. I know exactly where my blade's gonna cut. It's gonna make it a lot easier for lining up the work pieces. But before we start cutting the work pieces, I always like to grab a piece of scrap and do a test cut just to make sure that my blade is exactly how I want it. I know this might sound like a whole lot of work, but really it's not. It's because I'm explaining all of it. If I'm doing this on my own without a camera, less than a minute, I'm already set up, test cuts, I'm ready to go, and I know I'm gonna get perfect miters. After my angle is cut, now I can see if it's really at 45. And to do that, I use this piece of my combination square, and then I use a regular engineer square, and I put them together with my piece to see how it looks. Really easy. Set the engineering square down, put in my combination square. Now take my workpiece and I'm going to press it up against both, and it should fit in there nice and tight. And it looks like mine is just slightly off, so I'm going to tweak my blade just a hair, try another cut, see how it looks then, and I'm going to keep doing that until I know it's exactly at 45 degrees. Mine seems to be dead on, really happy with it, so now it's time to cut my actual work pieces. But a couple of things here. If you are doing all of this and for some reason, as you're measuring it, you just cannot get this right, it may not be you, it may not be your saw, it may not be your miter gauge, it could be something else. For instance, pro tip, use a stop block whenever you're making your cut. We will do our best to hold our piece up against this. We think it's nice and firm, we make our cut, but as that blade hits this workpiece, there can be some slight deflection, just a little bit. You won't notice it, but it throws off your cut. If you have a stop block that you're pressed up against, now it's firm, it's not going anywhere, then measure cut and see if that fixed it. Another thing is, you might have a really crappy blade. I hate to say that, but not all blades are created equal. And I know this from experience that I was having trouble with mine, and no matter what I did, I could not get it right. Come to find out is because I used a cheaper blade and there was a little bit of deflection in that blade and it was throwing off my cuts. So maybe you want to take this time to invest in a new blade or borrow a friend's blade and then try that out and see if that works for you. Then you know if that's the cause of the problem or if it's something else. Now that everything's set up, I'm going to cut my work pieces, which is some gorgeous Riffs-On sycamore. I can't wait to see this. I know that some of you are probably saying, why don't you just use one of those angle gauges and that will determine the blade and you don't have to do any of this crazy setup. Well, I have one of them. I've used it for a while and I don't find it to be accurate whatsoever. So I use my process, it's worked for me. Maybe you've got a better one and it's worked for you, but so there you have it. That's my process for cutting miter joints at the table saw. It's the same process whenever I cut joints for picture frames. Instead of moving the blade at 45 degrees, I move the fence at 45 degrees, but the same steps apply. If you really want to up your miter joint game, I have a couple more videos on miter joints, including one video where I show making a box using 3 different types of miter joints. Yeah, there are different types of miter joints. So you want to check that out. It's a really cool video and I go step by step on each one of those. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, then consider subscribing to the channel. And until we meet again, get in your shop and build something awesome.